Right, greetings. Thank you for coming. Welcome back. So this follows on from what we did last time, and what we're really doing is now bringing forward, looking at up-to-date animal welfare laws. And the reason we do this, and we've done this in the course over many years, is that we want you really to be well-grounded in the welfare law approach, both the ideology of it, the design, where it's got to, and what it's achieved. And at the end of this, what we do towards the end of this lecture is we take stock. And we say, well, you know, how's this working out? What are the advantages? What are the merits? What are the drawbacks? Next lecture, we're looking at a couple of really quite different countries, primarily Switzerland and the USA. So having taken stock, you'll then see what animal welfare law is capable of doing. So I say last time then, you recall we had the history which brought us up to where we are, and now it's exactly where we are in the system. What I'm going to do is look at a few laws, a few UK laws, and a few Swiss laws, a few European laws rather, to get a sense of what they're all doing. And as you may recall from last time, there is a remarkable degree of consistency in terms of the language used and the approach that they're adopting. So this one, Zoo Licensing Act, obviously zoos have gone through many functions and roles, from sort of being entertainment, being places of ex situ keeping of animals, protection, protecting a species, protecting individual animals, and so on, and as places, originally for people to observe animals from distant places. So the idea of conservation is something that a number of zoos talk about quite consistently. And what the Zoo Licensing Act is trying to do is sort of buy into that, and at the same time make sure that the individual animals are properly protected. So they're not only going to satisfy the biological and conservation requirements of the species, but they want an environment well adapted to meet the physical, psychological and social needs of the species. And that's providing each animal. So it's very much focusing on individual animals. A high standard of animal husbandry. All of the things we've seen before, going back to the 1964, the report, the 5 freedoms, and so on. High standard of husbandry, preventative and curative veterinary care, so the animal's health, and also, as we've seen before, licensing. And the idea of licensing, you remember, covers quite a lot of areas, because, of course, licensing is a way of making sure you know who's doing it. It means you've got a record of people, and also it creates a mechanism of renewal of licensing. It creates a mechanism for enforcement, and, if necessary, criminal sanctions. So this is very typical. You have to be licensed, you have to fulfill a duty, and you have to look after the animals in a range of ways. You remember, as was vivisection, in the 19th century had a very bad reputation, which is why there was a whole act on it, and you remember, just second half of the 19th century. And again, laws have been increasingly tightened up in relation to laboratory animals. In this case, it's quite a broad one. Any living vertebrate other than man, so including fish and amphibians and so on. There have been times when various animals have been excluded. Fish have often been excluded, and as we'll see next week, even in the present day, some very normal laboratory animals are excluded from some of the regulations. A regulated procedure. So the idea they're focusing in on this particular procedure, and as you see, a regulated procedure is an experiment or other scientific procedure, but it's one which has the effect of causing that animal pain, suffering, distress, or lasting harm. So the focus of this is an experiment that causes pain or suffering in some way. So that's what they're trying to deal with. They're trying to say, well, what can we do about that? Again, administer with a view to ensuring compliance with the 3 R's you probably come across: replace, reduce, refine. We won't have time, I think, this time, but if you're interested in looking at on the reading list, there's a number of government reports, both European Union and UK government, which suggests that while there is a commitment to the 3 Rs, actually the number of animals has not dropped. So it's not entirely clear what that commitment means. Again, as we saw from the 19th century, premises have to be registered, persons and projects. All of these, and these come straight out of the 1870 laws. And then breach is criminal. And as you recall, the idea of a criminal law is a disapproval, is a mark of disapproval. So here's just a couple of examples of the sort of ways that the regulations are trying to get involved. 2006, Animal Welfare Act. This was bringing together a lot of narratives. It seems to me a restating of the things that we're going back to Bramble and so on. So it's a very key part of the animal welfare legislation. So making owners and keepers, quite interesting though, so the idea that an animal might have an owner or it might have a keeper. And the idea of, therefore, if you're a keeper, you have a relationship with that animal, one of control, and therefore you're the best person to be able to not only exercise control, but also exercise a beneficial influence over the animal. The idea of including owners and keepers. If you go back to the 19th century, remember, the focus was very much on owners. And it was the idea of controlling the ownership, and the owner was the person responsible. Very standard stuff you've seen here: suitable environment, somewhere to live, suitable diet, normal behavior patterns, to be hired with or apart from other animals. And so the idea of this is now touching on to the idea of their social need, the need for company, the need for other animals, possibly the same species or a different species. Something you remember which came up in that New York case of Happy, who was on their own, carve-out, who was the animal on their own. But the idea that they should be with other animals is recognition of an animal's need, not just for diet and environment and so on, but actually company as well. And then protected from pain, injury, suffering and disease. So the idea, again, going back to something more basic. The application, any living vertebrate other than man, so really quite broad, all animals in captivity, so whether they're domestic or farmed, and again, it's an offence, a criminal offence, if you do something or fail to do something to cause an animal to suffer. And anyone who is may be banned from owning animals, fined, sent to prison. I remember a couple of years ago there was a movement to increase the maximum sentence for cruelty to animals. It was an important measure, but relatively few convicted people actually came anywhere near the high end of the sentence. So I think it was perhaps trying to sort of send a message, perhaps, and make a great deal of difference in terms of actual sentences. And then this idea of a duty of care. Now, all of these are really quite general. And again, we've seen this before. Using these general words, reasonable steps to make sure an animal's needs are met. Now, of course, the problem, as you're well aware, is that the more general the law, on the one hand, it sounds better. I think intrinsically, it feels better. That you're saying, yes, you need to take care of an animal's needs. It's a great idea. On the other hand, and of course covers a range of situations, on the other hand, of course, it makes it much harder to prosecute successfully. Because, what were the animal's needs? What did you actually do? How did that work? What were you not doing? So when you look at these rules, and when we go on to look at rights, it's important to remember that the appeal of the general laws is going to have a consequence in terms of specific enforcement. And we've got some laws later on which have gone very, very detailed, seem a bit trivial and yet also are very enforceable. And then prohibits unnecessary suffering. Unnecessary is a phrase, is a word that keeps coming round, and the idea of what's necessary, an act or a failure to act. Again, it's a criminal thing, so the person knew or ought reasonably to have known. Again, we need some sort of mens rea in there, that you should have known, ought reasonably to have known. Again, the idea that, you know, what should you have realised would have happened to the animal. And it was unnecessary in the sense of it could have been avoided. 5 freedoms, yes. You remember these following through, derived from Bramble, and some of them, obviously, I think you've seen them all pretty much before in various forms. So freedom from hunger and thirst, ready access. So very straightforward, feeding properly, providing proper nutrition. Freedom from discomfort and appropriate environment. Difficult to know what an appropriate environment is, but clearly there are going to be some that aren't, you know, just seem unreasonable for an animal's particular needs. Freedom from pain, injury and disease, we saw before. Express normal behaviour. When I read these, you often come away going, wow, these animal welfare laws are amazing. They're just incredible. They're looking after they want to provide normal behaviour, sufficient space, proper facilities, appropriate company. These are fantastic. What could possibly go wrong? What could possibly be missing from this? Because they're capable of having an enormous impact. Which leaves you with the question, well, what has gone wrong? Why is this language not translated into amazing conditions for animals? And if you like, the corollary, how did this language fail to deal with certainly some aspects of factory farming? You know, how did we get factory farming when we've got words like this? When we've got duties and obligations like this? And I think it's an interesting example of, if you like, the dynamic, we're going to come on to this, the dynamic between laws and what they say and what becomes accepted practice. Because what's actually happened, I think, is that we've chosen, and when I say we, I mean, you know, the players in the system have chosen to interpret things in ways that the language doesn't really allow, and yet we've chosen to go along with it. So it's a really interesting example of this potentially huge gap between the richness and the potential impact of the language and the practice. I'm going to go down a level now, if you like, in terms of detail and so on. So this is welfare of farmed animals regulations, UK regulation. A few more words. I'm not sure how much difference they make, but freedom of movement, having regard to their species in accordance with good practice. So in accordance with their species, in other words, how much freedom of movement do they want? How much do they normally enjoy in a wild state? In accordance with good practice. Again, it's a lovely phrase, which Raphael's going to cover next week. It's a lovely phrase, the idea of good practice. Is good practice different from best practice? Well, it must be, because it's got different words. But what's good practice? I mean, what everyone's doing, what everyone else is doing? Is this part of the dynamic that I've just talked about, which has brought things down to lower levels? Scientific knowledge. Interesting, one of the things that Bramble did was really start bringing science and scientists into the frame and really saying, no, there has to be a symbiosis between our scientific knowledge and the practice of how we actually treat animals. And I think it's quite interesting. The last, 10 years, I think, have made a real difference in terms of our knowledge of fish, and particularly farmed fish, therefore. And that's having an impact on how we do, on how we manage farmed fisheries. A much greater awareness, not only of sort of disease and so on issues, but also in terms of the sort of psychological needs of fish. And you mustn't restrict in ways cause, again, it's an unnecessary suffering. Again, a very specific scenario where animals are continuously or regularly tethered or confined. So, got a slight contrast here, that they're continuously or regularly tethered or confined, but they have to be given enough space. And I never quite work out how I can put these two together, but anyway. So if they are tethered or confined, they still have to have enough space for their physiological and ethological needs. In other words, what do they want? What do they normally have? What do they normally enjoy? And again, good practice, scientific knowledge. Okay, I'm going to move across now to our sort of first bit of comparative stuff, comparative law, going into European law. And since Raphael and I have been teaching this for 5 years, this used to be just law, but now it's obviously legal history, or whatever you want to call it. Probably better take that bit out.
Although not with the Council of Europe.
Sorry? Oh yes, we're still part of the Council of Europe. You're right. Not legal history. Thank you, Council of Europe. Anyway, so 1976, so long tradition. Convention applying to keeping, care and housing of animals, in particular animals in modern intensive stock farming. So focusing very much on factory farming. And the definition, predominantly employ technical installations operated principally by means of automatic processes. So quite an interesting way of focusing in on factory farming, that it principally use of automatic processes. Housed and provided with food, water and care, in a manner which, having regard to their species, so what does that species need, their degree of development, adaptation and domestication, so what are they used to in terms of environment, appropriate to their physiological and ethological needs in accordance with established experience and scientific knowledge. So these phrases keep coming round. They keep coming around. We talk about scientific knowledge. We talk about custom. We talk about established experience. Uses words like, ethological, physiological, and so on. Which, as I say, should have an enormous meaning. Quite an interesting one here, the lighting, temperature, humidity. So very physical here. Very physical conditions, and again, conform to the physiological and ethological needs, established experience, scientific knowledge. So it's saying, what is the best environment for animals? How should we be looking after them? Right, now we do move into legal history. Council Directive, again, farming purposes. Member states make provision to ensure the owners or keepers take all reasonable steps. My God, that's a Weasley phrase. I don't know what a reasonable step is. And as you can see, this isn't to be enforced directly, but terribly difficult to make enforceable. What's reasonable? What everyone else does, what I should do, what I could do, and so on. To ensure the welfare of animals and their care, to ensure that those animals are not caused any unnecessary pain, suffering, or injury. How far is one supposed to go? When do things become reasonable or unreasonable? And Article 4, again, we're into the same language. I won't spend very long. This case, they've excluded fish. Animals are bred or kept, physiological, ethological, established experience, scientific knowledge. So you've got this sort of, I was going to say triumvirate, but there's 4 of them, so it can't be triumvirate. You've got this sort of set of players, ideas, that are focusing in on how we should be looking after animals. A different one, keeping animals in zoos. So the object to protect, so we're again recognising the role of zoos, protecting wild fauna, conserving biodiversity. So very much talking about zoos having that function. And what they're doing here is they're adopting measures for licensing and inspection. But the idea is that the zoos are there for protecting and conservation, strengthening the role of zoos in the conservation of biodiversity. So this is the underlying premise that is being set out is that's what zoos are there for. That's what they do. And the animals need to be kept in conditions which satisfy the biological and conservation requirements of the individual species. I've never entirely understood what those words mean. I can understand the biological requirements. I'm not sure what the conservation requirements are. Means not dying, I suppose, but it probably goes along anyway. Maintaining a high standard of species-specific enrichment of the enclosures, high standard of animal husbandry, and again, the veterinary care. So we're seeing these same words go round and round. They're very good words. They're potentially very powerful. But the question is whether that power is actually coming through. Another one, this one, protection of pigs. And the reason I've gone here is to see now how you can really drill down. You can really get very detailed. So we're now talking about pigs, essentially pigs being kept indoors. And this is about, as you see, improving the quality of flooring surfaces and increasing the living space available for sows and gilts. And also it wants to improve training. So we're now getting down to floor space, living space. Concrete slatted floors are used for pigs. So we're now specifying the maximum width of the opening. So you can imagine a sort of the slatting on the floor with gaps between them. So what we're doing here is measuring things. Now, in one sense, it seems sort of almost trivial. In another sense, it's eminently enforceable. So it's a very enforceable set of rules. Very easy to see whether someone's complying. And to be fair to the industry, very easy for the industry to know when it's compliant. Because, the other side of the coin is we have to accept that there are obviously many farmers, many in the industry, who want to comply with the regulations, who do not wish to break the law or anything like that. So from their point of view, they need to know when there's compliance and what they need to be doing. And in many ways, some of these sort of rather loose words don't really help. Okay, so let's park that and go up really to almost the opposite end of the spectrum, in a way, in terms of drafting. Lisbon Treaty. Now this, you remember, the UK obviously withdrew from, which obviously generated the problem of, well, is the UK recognising animals as sentient? So, in formulating the Union's policies, agricultural and fisheries policies, the Union and Member States shall, since animals are sentient beings. So just stay with that for a moment. It should be, this should be a terribly powerful phrase. This idea, the recognition of animals are sentient. So in a way, it's not saying anything fundamentally new, because, there's been evidence of that for a long time. But since they are sentient. And of course, the word since means the implication is because they're sentient, therefore these things should follow. And what follows should fit with the idea of the sentience. What follows should be connected to the idea, well, they're sentient, therefore. And of course, as you're aware, sentient brings in concepts of intelligence, awareness, sensitivity, memory, ability to look forward, to remember, self-identity, and those sort of ideas. Since animals are sentient beings. And then it sort of fades away. Shall pay full regard to the welfare requirements of animals. Desperately limp phrase that follows this great statement. And then we're left with shall pay full regard to. I mean, I'm not sure what else you say. Okay. I'll pay full regard to it. As though somehow people weren't paying full regard to it before or something. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear your views when we, afterwards when we have questions. But just seems to me a real shame. You're expecting this great follow through, and then you're left with, obviously you need to take account of their welfare. You need to have full regard to their welfare requirements. Again, I don't know what it means. And while you're enjoying that, you don't even have to do that in full, because obviously you have to respect legislative administrative provisions, and you have to respect the culture, the customs of the member states, relating in particular to religious rights, cultural traditions, and regional heritage. So, obviously if there's a cultural tradition in your part of Europe, which perhaps isn't very animal welfare friendly, well, that should be all right, because we want to respect your cultural traditions, your religious rights. Again, if your religious rights, possibly would challenge or undermine the welfare of animals, that's all right, because although we're paying full regard to it, we also have to respect the customs and the religious rights and cultural traditions and regional heritage. Very interesting, putting all those together. I can sort of follow the religious rights story. I have greater difficulty with cultural traditions. So the Stamford bull running, which I think stopped about 150 years ago, presumably, had it not stopped, it would have carried on. And would then now be a cultural tradition or a regional heritage of the town of Stamford that they chase bulls. In fact, they still do it in some places. We had a conference 2 years ago, I think, Raphael, where we had people coming from Spain and talking about some of their cultural traditions. It's an interesting, slightly shocking idea that we're willing to move away so far from the high ground of sentience. Right, council regulation. This is protection of animals at the time of killing. I always found this a slightly sort of macabre or ironic set of laws, which is probably wrong of me, because it is important. It can be obviously very stressful for animals when they're about to be slaughtered. So recognising killing animals may induce pain, distress, fear, or other forms of suffering. Some of you may be familiar with the American designer of animal slaughterhouses, Temple Grandin, who's written some very interesting books and made some films on really improving the quality of life of animals as they go into slaughter. And I think she's made an enormous difference. So the recognition it may cause these things, and you should take necessary measures to avoid pain and minimising distress and suffering, taking account the best practice in the field and what's permitted under regulation. So sounds pretty good. And then we've seen something that takes us back to Victorian laws. So it's a matter of public concern. So yes, so there's an interesting motivation. We've seen that in other areas. I'm not sure I have it in this slide, but one of the EU regulations to do with the use of great apes, I think, and bonobos in experimentation is that we have to be very careful because the public are concerned about this. So it's a matter of public concern, and it affects consumer attitudes. That's fine. And then we're back into an old story. Also improves the protection of animals at the time of slaughter, contributes to higher meat quality. So wonderful. We're back into the 19th century. Why are we banning cockfighting? Well, because it's it creates an affray. It encourages affray. It encourages bad behaviour. We're not necessarily trying to protect the cockerels, and in this case, better happier animals at the time of slaughter gives you higher quality meat. So whether that's just a sort of add-on or a freebie or an extra benefit, it seems to me that it certainly seems to slightly undercut the moral high ground of the regulation. Different area now, scientific purposes. new scientific knowledge available in respect to factors influencing animal welfare, necessary to improve the welfare of animals used in scientific procedures by raising minimum standards. So again, basically saying, yes, because we're aware that animals can express, they have sense, animals can sense and express pain, suffering, distress, we want to improve the welfare in line with the latest scientific developments. So going beyond the scientific knowledge we've seen before. Scientific evidence, their ability to experience pain, suffering, distress, and lasting harm. Interestingly, bringing in some other animals, particularly cephalopods and so on, a recognition that they can suffer. And they have an intrinsic value which must be respected. This takes us back to the sentient concept, I think. They have an intrinsic value which must be respected. So, again, potentially very powerful, because what's happening here is they're being used as objects. So their intrinsic value must be respected, but we're going to do it anyway. Again, this sort of contrast. Ethical concerns by the general public, as I said, and therefore animals should always be treated as sentient creatures. I mean, putting it plainly, I don't think you can have both concepts on the table at the same time. I don't think you can have sentient and intrinsic value and should always be treated as sentient creatures and then say, but we're going to do experimentation. You can't, I don't think you can have the two side by side. I think this is just living with two potential, I mean, in terms of language, in terms of meaning of the laws, I just don't see how you can put the two together. We've almost been able to create two separate bubbles which we've just joined. It seems to me there's simply no follow-through in terms of accepting the impact of the words we're using. Again, the use of non-human primates is still necessary in biomedical research because of the present state of it. Obviously, we use non-human primates, but it raises specific ethical and practical problems in terms of meeting their behavioral, environmental, and social needs in a laboratory. Yes. And it's of the greatest concern to the public. I have difficulty putting that sentence. What's that got to do with anything? If what we're doing is harmful and wrong, why does the fact that the public care more or care less have any relevance to it? It's almost, can you see, it's almost we're taking these grand words and then pulling them down. And then taking the value out of them. As I say, the idea that the use of non-human primates is a concern to the public shouldn't be relevant to what's happening. The fact that slaughtering animals, the meat tastes better if the animals aren't stressed, shouldn't be relevant to how they're treated at the time of slaughter. Okay, so I've sort of laid out how we've been going about these things. The next 10 minutes or so, last 10 minutes, I want to take stock and I want to look ahead a little bit. Because I may have left you with the impression that animal welfare has not been successful. And of course it has. It's made an enormous difference and continues to do so. And yes, it would be naive to imagine that the interest of the public is not a factor, because this is political change. And political change involves using political capital for a government or a political party, and if there is public support, you're using up less capital, you're pushing less against an electorate, against a population. So, of course, the interest of the public is relevant. But if we look at the words themselves, I just want to leave you, I think, with the ideas that we seem to be saying a lot of really good things, and yet it doesn't seem to be following through. So I quite like the SWOT analysis, which you've probably come across, the SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. It's a very, I find it quite a useful and simple way of breaking into things. So yeah, animal welfare, there's a lot going. It's a long tradition in many countries. Many countries have had this now for 100, 150 years. So we're used to it. Obviously, we're going to see in the next few weeks the idea of animals as property and whether in a system of animal rights animals can still be property or whether it challenges fundamentally our ability to have rules and to relate to animals. But what I think we've done is that because animal welfare has been around for so long, what it has done is created an acceptance that, yes, it is property, but you have rules and obligations about how you look after animals. So whether one goes as far as saying, well, they're a different sort of property, I think that that's probably not a bad way of viewing animals. I think they are a different sort of property, and we're increasingly seeing in various areas, family law, for example, that the nature of the animal goes beyond the simple ownership property thing. So the long tradition is important. It means that we're generally comfortable with it. And also, of course, it's generally accepted that cruelty to animals is wrong. So I think, again, it's created this dynamic, if you like, between society and the rules that we really shouldn't be harming animals and so on. It's global, which means, it's an easier thing. You're not getting countries having to sort of relearn or place, expectations on other countries which is alien to them. The idea of animal cruelty and animal welfare is a global thing. And of course, as I said, the situation is still a dynamic one. Animal welfare laws continue to develop and cover more and more areas as issues arise. Export of live animals is an obvious one, so that laws are evolved to meet them. Weaknesses. Obviously, the nature of animal welfare, as we saw from one of those laws, is about control of an animal all the way up to the point of death. So it's intrinsic in the paradigm of welfare that we can own animals, we can do what we like with them, we can exploit them, and we can kill them and eat them. In other words, all of those things are an intrinsic part of the system. That isn't necessarily bad, but we need to accept that that's what the paradigm of welfare is. It is about those things. Welfare does not encompass the idea of not killing the animal. It doesn't encompass the idea of not having control over animals. So if one doesn't want that to happen, then welfare essentially won't achieve that. Welfare could achieve a huge amount, but it can't do that. Secondly, there are issues in terms of enforcement. We're not really sure how much animal welfare laws are enforced. There's little bits of data, but there's not very much. There's a bit of evidence about how much inspections are carried out, how often inspections are carried out, those sort of things. We don't really know about the level of compliance. We sort of have an sort of assumption it's all right. But there are issues in terms of law enforcement, training, resources, for example, financial pressures where you've got a single enforcement body. Obviously, in the UK, you've got the RSPCA is able to prosecute, but is there familiarity? Personal bias. There's a number of cases where the the potential breach of the animal welfare rules was being done by someone who was respected in the community, a landowner or whatever. And therefore there was sort of, well, that person can't have done these bad things. So there's a sort of cultural, personal bias. Financial pressure, yes, the idea that we have limited resources to prosecute. Shouldn't we be going after the usual bad guys instead of people who mistreated a cow or something? And obviously community pressure, again, the same thing. We should be after real crime rather than what is perhaps not regarded as real crime. That's right, the same way. Another weakness. Actually, things are a bit slow. Yeah, yellow, and animal welfare and anti-cruelty, so not just mustn't harm, mustn't be cruel, mustn't inflict pain, but also welfare, good conditions, good food, medical, veterinary support, and so on, company of other animals. So that's the yellow. The red only have anti-cruelty, in other words, you mustn't actually be cruel. And that leaves the blue with nothing at all. And the blue part is surprisingly large. And what that means is there are no animal protection laws. So whatever you do is fine. And another way of seeing the same thing, this is a map. I think you can probably see it clearly enough. Basically goes from sort of green to dark red. Green is good and dark red is bad in terms of the quality of animal welfare protection. Quite a lot in the middle. So it is a weakness. The progress of animal welfare is good, and there are a lot of countries that are enforcing it, but there's still a lot that are not. I mentioned the language problem. This was a report from the European Commission on a period ending in 2015. The General Directive on the Protection of Farm Animals contains provisions that are too general to have practical effects. Remember the language we were talking about. Have access to feed at intervals appropriate to their physiological needs, accommodating animals which aim to satisfy the biological and conservation requirements. In other words, what they're saying is these words, these phrases are just too general to have practical effects. But these are the sort of phrases we see over and over again. And of course, welfare and high welfare have different meanings. This is a high welfare chicken shed. Opportunities, yes, welfare's still got a lot going for it. There's an increasing role for science and technology, best scientific practice. As I say, there's been an influence on things like fish farming. There are technologies coming in with other forms of meat, non-meat meat, cell-based meat, plant-based meat, and so on. So we're learning more about the needs of animals, and that what we have done is over the last few years, particularly from Bramble, is we brought science into the story. So the idea this isn't a sort of public concern-driven thing or political-driven. This is about the idea that the science and the behaviour should be linked together, that as we get better knowledge, that will improve conditions. And I think that symbiosis is there. Yes, another opportunity, equally, of course, there's public interest. I think there is more interest in public welfare, in animal welfare, and of course also in different meat diets. And of course, related to public interest is quite an emphasis the last few weeks, probably noticed, on the impact of cattle on global warming and methane emissions and so on. And also, interestingly, the sort of relative differences between different animals. So, cows, for example, have roughly double the amount of methane emissions as, I think, pigs. I think those are roughly double that of chickens. So I'm not sure it's necessarily better to eat chickens rather than cows, but at least it's showing an awareness of the impact of animals. And one of the suggestions is that less meat will reduce methane, and that, of course, can then tie into welfare. Private prosecution, obviously, takes away from demands on the public purse for enforcement. And as I say, the idea of globalisation, so we're getting, just as there's globalisation in terms of trade, so there's also globalisation in terms of awareness of the rules. The opportunities, so a few years ago, the UK introduced closed-circuit television in slaughterhouses. So now you've got this automated way of monitoring things. So really quite interesting. And I can see a situation where you tie in, say, closed-circuit television with sort of body recognition, bodily action recognition, which we're already starting to do, so that you can actually assess whether the animals are happy or showing signs of distress. And you can do that automatically. So it cuts leasing costs down. And then the threats. The main threat, I think, is that because they're regulations and because they're political regulations, they're part of a dynamic. And that dynamic is about consumer awareness. It's about the needs of business. You know, I suggested here, it adds costs. Welfare adds costs. And I've, spoken and heard from farmers who say, look, I'd be happy to have better welfare, but I'm not paid anymore for it. So all that's happening is that, my higher welfare is simply reducing my profits. And if I put my prices up, then I'm losing commercial opportunities because I'm being competed against. And as you remember, that's one of the issues in the potential treaty with the US, the idea that maybe lower welfare food will come in. So there's no doubt that I don't think there's a fundamental threat to animal welfare, but I think there is a threat in terms of detail. In other words, yes, there is movement towards increasing welfare, but I think because of the international side, the international trade side and so on, it is possible that they could be reduced, or it's possible they could simply become static, and we reach an equilibrium. And of course, the most likely for that would be simply consumer acceptance. So I remember an interview with someone who said, well, I think he was selling sausages, and he said, well, we'll stick the Union Jack on the packet because people think it's all right to have the Union Jack. And there we go. Thank you very much.